15-year-old girl named Donna lived with her father in a small house. Ever since her mother died, Donna had depended on her father for everything. They had a wonderful relationship and loved each other very much. One morning, Donna's father was leaving on a business trip. As they had breakfast together, he told her that he would be home very late that night. With that, he kissed her on the forehead, grabbed his briefcase, and walked out the front door. Later that day, when Donna came home from school, she did some homework and watched some TV. By midnight, her father had still not returned, so she decided to go to bed. That night, she had a dream. She found herself standing at the edge of a busy highway. Cars and trucks whizzed by at an alarming rate. She looked across the highway and saw a familiar figure standing on the other side. It was her father. His hands were cupped around his mouth and he seemed to be shouting something to her. But she couldn't make out what he was saying. As the traffic whizzed by, she trained to hear. Her father's eyes were sad. He seemed to be desperately trying to communicate something to her. She could barely make out the words. Don't open door. Suddenly, Donna was awoken from the dream by a strange tapping noise. Then somebody began to ring the doorbell downstairs. She scrambled out of bed and put on her slippers. Then, dressed only in her nightgown, she ran downstairs and went to the front door. Looking through the peephole, she saw her father's face outside. He was staring right at her. The doorbell kept ringing instantly. Okay, hold on, I'm coming, she shouted. She pulled back the deadbolt and was about to unlock the door when she stopped. She looked through the peephole at her father again. Something about his expression didn't look quite right. His eyes were wide open. He looked terrified. She slid the deadbolt back into place. Dad, she yelled through the door. Did you forget your keys? Ringing. Dad, answer me. Ringing. Dad, please, I need you to answer me. Ringing. Is there someone else out there with you? Ringing. Why don't you answer me? Ringing. I'm not opening the door until you say something. The doorbell kept ringing and ringing, but for some reason her father refused to answer her desperate cries. For the rest of the night, the frightened girl cowered in a corner of the hallway, helplessly listening to the ceaseless ringing of the doorbell. It seemed to go on for hours. Eventually, she fell into an easy sleep. At dawn, she woke up and realized that everything was quiet. She crept over to the door and looked through the peephole again. Her father was still there, staring at her. She cautiously opened the door and was confronted with a sight that filled her with unimaginable horror. Her father's severed head was hanging from a nail above the door. There was a note attached to the doorbell. It read, Clever girl. There was a young couple who had just gotten married. The wedding was wonderful, and they took many photos so that they would remember the happy occasion forever. For their honeymoon, they traveled to France and stayed in a dark old mansion. The first night, the young woman felt scared, and despite her husband's attempts to reassure her, she could not sleep. To clear her head, she decided to go downstairs to the library and read a little. She selected a book at random from the dusty old shelves and opened it. Inside, there were only pictures, pictures of herself. The pictures were from her wedding. The woman was shocked at first, but then she thought about it. Her husband must have put together a wedding album as a surprise for her. He was probably planning to give it to her the next day. She flipped through the pictures in the album, her mind going back to how wonderful the wedding day had been. When she reached the end of the album, there were more pages with pictures, but they were not of the wedding. In fact, she wondered what these strange pictures were doing in the album. It seemed as if they had been stapled in. The first page showed a picture of a woman standing in a library, holding a book in her hands. On the second page, there was another picture of the woman But this time, the library door was open. Feeling a little uneasy, she turned to look at the door. It was closed. On the third page of the book, the door was wide open and a faceless man was standing behind the woman. Again, she glanced over her shoulder, but the door was closed. Flipping to the last page of the book, she saw that in the picture the faceless man was standing right behind the woman, his arm raised and clutching a knife. The next morning, the husband woke up and could not find his wife. He decided to search the house, but when he got to the library, he found the door wouldn't open. It was stuck. Putting all his weight behind it, he pushed against the door with his shoulder and eventually it opened. Behind the door, he found his wife lying in a pool of blood. There was a knife sticking out of her back. A mother and daughter were traveling together in Europe. When they arrived in Paris, they booked into a luxury hotel. The mother was feeling quite poorly and decided to go to bed early. The daughter was a little worried and sent for the hotel doctor, who examined the mother and wrote out a prescription. The daughter then set out into the city to find a pharmacy and buy the medicine for her mother. What should have been a simple errand ended up taking the daughter almost 4 hours, mainly because she spoke little or no French. She searched the entire city and eventually managed to find a pharmacy that was still open. Finally, the frustrated daughter arrived back at the hotel with the medicine, only to discover that her mother's room completely empty. It was as if her mother had just vanished into thin air. In fact, the hotel room looked completely different. The carpet, the wallpaper, and the curtains all had different patterns. The bed was made and looked as if it had never been slept in. All of their luggage was nowhere to be found. When the confused daughter stopped a cleaning lady in the corridor and asked where her mother was, she was met with a blank stare. In fact, all of the hotel staff denied ever seeing the mother and daughter before. The hotel manager even said he had no record of them ever checking into the hotel. At this point, the daughter became frantic and she fled to the embassy, where she was greeted by sympathetic officials who wouldn't believe her story. Instead, they doubted that her mother ever existed and decided that the daughter must be crazy. Trapped in a nightmare, the young girl ended up being sent to a mental hospital, where she died years later, completely insane.